Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Transformation podcasts. In today's episode, we will be discussing the world of tech. So I'm going to learn quite a lot, and more particularly the place of women in tech. And I'm delighted to welcome Anne-Marie Imafidon, CEO of the non-for-profit STEMettes. Anne-Marie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Susie. Hi, listener.
It's a pleasure. I'm actually delighted to get the chance to engage with you on this important topic. But, as we move into this technologically driven world and the quest that I know you have through STEMettes, but not only, to help women take back tech and actually to democratize access to tech in general in terms of who it's accessible to, how it's accessible to them. And in fact, you were awarded an MBE for this work, and you continue to wear that hat and many others. From former president of the British Science Association to co-chair at the Institute for the Future of Work, and you're on the board of many future-looking tech ventures, such as the Royal College of Art or the Council of Digital Economy. And not to mention your recent book, Watching and Holding Up. Great book. Also a guidebook on how to take back tech, particularly as a woman, and how to break the stereotypes that surround the access to tech and how involved we are in the definition of what's being put into the digital world, if you like. And I loved the refreshingly simple anecdotes in your book, particularly the one of where you just wanted to know how things worked and you took apart a VHS recorder at the age of 4 to have a look inside and see what happens. I mean, I'm sure quite a lot of us asked ourselves that question. How can I see what's on my screen? If I open the box, is it inside? Which is essentially one that really stuck with me from your book. And that's how I feel. We were talking a little bit before. That's how I feel when I try and work Zoom or Teams or lots of applications where sometimes I just don't feel that I'm technically fluent enough. So let's start there. We'll come back to technical fluency, but all these hats, and I haven't mentioned them all, that you wear regularly all the time. Is that a representation of you and your personality, your curiosity? How would you describe yourself?
It is a representation, actually, yeah, of the things that I care about, the things I'm interested in, and the fact that, I can't sit still. For better or for worse. So I always describe myself as someone who likes maths, likes tech, and likes helping people. And so in sitting in all of those seats and wearing all of those hats, and many more, all of them are about helping others or engaging with the mass, engaging with technology, but basically ensuring that I leave things better than I found them. And I think there definitely is a curiosity for you to have an understanding, right, of what needs to be better, what could be better, what does better look like, what are even the fields that you're able to kind of affect that change, and how do you affect that change, and how you're able to do it systemically. Do you do it where you are? Do you do it outside? Can you do many things at the same time? So I think it's definitely a reflection of me. And the second part of the question?
It was, how would you describe yourself? So you're actually,
I covered that. There we go. All good.
Once,
yeah, I'm all
great.
over the place, I guess you could say. I describe myself as Anne-Marie often enough. And that means whatever it means at that point in my life, or at that point in the day, or at that day in the week. But all of it does come back to this. It's one of those things where sometimes you can see what could happen, and it's not too late to change the course, to have it be slightly less dystopian, or slightly less destructive. And so most of what I'm doing, or most of what I do, most of what I spend my time doing, is to try and counteract that and mitigate that, knowing that there's some form of agency I have over elements of what happens next.
Yeah, and I love the fact that in your book it is about agency, but every single person's agency to, 1, be curious, 2, act, and 3, change, however big or small, either their journey or the direction of something or the way things are perceived. And I know you started STEMettes as a result of being at that huge conference where you just sort of looked around and thought, oh, okay, there aren't many women or non-binary people here. Okay, is this normal type of thing? And you talk also about manuals, which I love for the panels, because they often are full of middle-aged white men who seem to have a monopoly on the definition and what we're doing in tech, which, you know, hence your quest. But we're making progress, I think. Is it sufficient? No, but do you think we're making sufficient progress for us to get to a place in the next 4 or 5 years where we are talking about the women in tech? Because, you know, unless you research, and I learned so much from your book on the different women who've done different things in tech that I knew nothing about. I knew some of them, but only because I've read certain things or I've been in museums where it's been in, let's be clear, small print at the bottom of a poster or whatever. But it was so interesting for me, Anne-Marie, to read that and think, okay, wow, because representation is one thing, but people just being sort of erased is another.
Yeah, and that's a huge problem. And I think that's why being at that conference for me it was being at one where it was majority women. So it was 3,500 technical women all in one place at the same time, talking the tech and talking the other things that women, I guess, talk about, but standing in the same queue for the loo, right? Which, you know, if you're at tech conferences, you never really have to queue for the loo if you're going for the women's loos. I think, yeah, the representation and the herstory is incredibly important, because there's so much of the decisions that we make now, the social norms that we have, you know, if we want stereotypes, right, that are kind of founded on our telling of that history and of that herstory, and nothing at all or nothing too much against, you know, those middle-aged white men, because they're only kind of following in the image of what they've seen, what's been repeated to them again and again, which is also the reason why we as women often, you know, end up counting ourselves out of these spaces, right? Or end up not being valued when we are in these spaces because we're not necessarily what that default norm, right, or that vision of success has been defined around in the stories that we've told of who has gone before us, who has made this technology, who has been at the top, who has contributed value. You know, I often end up talking about kind of dead white men with beards, because that's the story that we're told again and again. And it's fascinating that you need all four of them. So the middle-aged men aren't always, you know, as close as they might even think to the success, right? They haven't grown the beard or they're not dead. And so I think there is something about the representation, about the stories that we're telling and the impact that has on what success could look like, who has value to contribute, who deserves to be in these spaces, who was born to be in these spaces versus folks who have worked to be in these spaces. And it is quite frustrating, as you said, it's why I started Stemettes, because there are lots of people who are alive and don't have beards who have a lot to contribute in these spaces. But even more so, it's dangerous when technology is no longer a niche thing, right? When I was younger, it was like, oh, Anne-Marie, you and your tech thing. Whereas now, you know, it's not just me. The people that know me know that this tech thing is beyond me. They will see technical things that have got nothing to do with Anne-Marie. Whereas as a classically trained computer scientist, there's so much that's kind of passion projects or small things that we have done, have built, have worked on, that it was never even taught that the scale, the size, the impact that these would have in the very short time frame that we're now in, right? We're entering this fourth industrial revolution. And so where these tech projects, we might have just thought ICT and digital was to the side, now it's very much fundamental to what life is as we see it, or as we live it, as we experience it, right, as it continues on. And so it is quite important, incredibly important, actually, to the point that it's almost dangerous if we continue to have a small set of folks making technical decisions, because those decisions aren't just technical, they are social, they are political, they are moral, they are ethical. And so it's important for us to have different types of people. And I think the gender element is almost one of the initial steps, that if you're not able to have that one protected characteristic represented across your technology, then that's not going to filter into the decisions, the solutions, the products. But I think also for me, it's, you know, as a Black woman, right, that's another thing. As an able-bodied Black woman, that's something, you know, as someone who's not pregnant, you know, there's all these elements of life that then don't get reflected that we have in the protected characteristics, but there's also beyond that. And so it means that there's a lot of experiences, a lot of perspectives that go missing from the technology that then become harmful when that technology ends up being deployed and used for power, used to maintain power structures, whatever it might be, in places that are quite far from where that initial technologist was, or where that initial kind of product feature set was decided. And so there's a responsibility that we do have as well to ensure that we are telling that history, and we're telling that story of those who are dead, but also those who are here now.
Yeah, of course.
So that then we can enable all of us to see the value in lots of different types of people, but also the young people, others that kind of coming in, and not just young people, people stepping into the scene and stepping out of the scene, right, are able to see that it's not just one vision of success. If you're going to ask someone about a journalist or ask someone about a singer, it's not always one vision that we have of what great singers look like. And so that's it. It's incredibly important.
And if I look at the amount of time it takes to change, let's say, hearts and minds and perspectives and societal norms, and the amount of time, the exponential speed of tech, what do you think the biggest risk is in the next 4 or 5 years? Because if I look at meeting the system where it's at, which is exactly what we're doing, there's quite a lot of both types of change. Technological change is going to happen. And the other change, we're engineering it more, but it's going to be slower. What do you think the biggest risk is there that you see from your window?
So I think the biggest risk still is that technological change and the speed at which it's happening, and the diversity of the use cases and the spaces in which it's being deployed is going to end up is going to continue, or maybe is going to exponentially create more problems than it's solving. And so I think there's a big risk. The risks abound, really, whether it's safety, whether it's fairness, whether it's, I don't know, you don't want to be dramatic, right? The collapse of society, right? If we forget that particular people are there and we automate such and this, or we, automate the decisions and no one's part of it. I mean, I'm chair at the Institute for the Future of Work, and there's so many things that we put out on our, we call it the lab. So it's kind of our repository of kind of research papers and briefings and all sorts that kind of the general public, kind of any person who works or engages with the workplace can definitely access. There's quite a lot that we've kind of been able to unpick around the impact that this has on the individual, right? If you're making those, if you're rating, if you're reviewing, if you're making decisions on pay, if you're making decisions on promotions, you're making decisions on hiring, like all of these things, there's a risk there of accelerating it to the point that we genuinely are making the wrong decisions, making unfair decisions, making dangerous decisions. I mean, just look at the post office scandal, right? This is deploying technology in a way that then is without the right checks and balances, that then has had catastrophic kind of upshots from that. So I think there's one thing on the individual. I think the second one is for companies and for organizations, and there are risks in, again, the way you do business, how you generate your models, like what is the products and the quality of the products that you're able to put out, not just as a technical organization, but an organization that is using this technology to, again, make those decisions, do your production, all of that kind of set of things. What's the sustainability of that, right? What's the impact on your local environment? What's the impact on the global environment, right? Of what you're doing. So I think there's risks in deploying technology that hasn't got all those considerations in it, given that the society, like you said, that social norm is still working at pace, and that technology is having to still exist alongside that social norm. And I think that the final level that we talk about the Institute is the kind of the societal and the wider and the systems impact then we have of that technology. And one example would be something like Uber was a tech product. They were matching people up together. Taxis already existed, passengers already existed. That was already something that was happening before Uber came along. However, deploying that technology in that space meant that actually there are extra questions that were then thrown up about the relationship between that subcontractor and the tech platform, the safety of the passengers that were riding in that, and that had come from decisions made by a company about their business model, that had come from decisions made by individuals about, the way they wanted to engage with the technology. So I think that there's almost there's levels of risk that we have to then explore and be mindful of. But with most risks, that there are mitigations that we have. And so I think a lot of what I do is what I feel is the biggest lever or the biggest mitigation that we can deploy, which is to have as many of those perspectives as possible in those rooms so that you can make those decisions holistically and safely, and you can have the right checks and balances that mean that, I don't know, Susie, if we were in the room when they said, I'm going to make this tool that allows anyone to say anything to anyone at any time, I'm pretty sure the two of us could have come up with maybe 3 examples that morning alone of things that have been said to us unsolicited that we would have said, hey, why don't we ask some more questions before we allow this to happen millions of times a second on a global scale. And I think it's just having more of that sense and valuing that in technical spaces where historically we've purely valued technical prowess.
Yeah, and also
and
it's
you're not building
around
technology for the sake of tech.
no, and it's around thinking though, isn't it? I'm just listening to you thinking that's divergent thinking, and a lot of the education system is built on and educates around convergent thinking. And it's interesting because then you find it in organizations, of course, and so therefore the systems that you put into organizations and the way they work and the way they debate or not, and the way they make decisions is often convergent thinking as opposed to divergent thinking. So do you think that businesses and organizations, over and above their global responsibilities on sustainability and ethical business, do you think they have a role to play in upskilling people within that organization to use the tech responsibly, to understand what tech they're using, and to use it responsibly for social engineering within the organization? Because it's an area where I see people flailing all the time, and it's never really spoken about. It's become one of those hush-hush subjects, you know?
Yeah, it's not spoken about because it's quite a big change, and you know, a lot of this why my book's called Choosing Control. A lot of this does come back to power and power
Yeah,
dynamics.
of course.
And who is used to being on top, who's used to being in the majority, who's used to being heard and listened to, and you know, whether that's a power you're open to sharing, or you understand the benefits of you know, everything not just centering on your experiences, but also whether you understand the fact that the technology actually allows us to have a multiplicity of experiences reflected. And so let's lean into that as much as is possible. So I think it's definitely a responsibility. And I think it's also because of this levels that we're talking about, right? What you do as a company is not just for you and your company, it's for your supply chain, it's for your customers, and no company is an island, so it's for society at large. And so the norms that you set in your company also then have that impact outside. And so you kind of take that sphere of influence seriously. But yeah, like I think there is something of we as I said, we default to thinking that technology is neutral, and it's not. And so it means you have to take it, whatever you are doing, you are taking a stance. And it's not necessarily a binary that it's good or bad, but you are taking a stance that means that there are complexities of life that you'll need to grapple with and reflect in the complexities of the technology that you're building. And so it is something that folks have the responsibility, the skilling up 100%. But I think employers have had that anyway, and it's good for business if your staff are educated, your staff understand how to use the tools well. There's a couple of examples that we've seen and kind of continue to kind of explore of organizations that, I don't know, have brought in are producing more electric vehicles, and so are having to upskill their staff on, you know, the construction of that and the maintenance of that, versus folks who've been, you know, working on diesel vehicles for decades. But even more so, you know, when we talk about jobs being evolved or jobs kind of having to change because of the shift in this fourth industrial revolution, I think there's also the idea of, hey, that person wasn't born with the knowledge that they have and that they're deploying in your workplace. And so they definitely can, there's an additive, right, that you can have of, they already knew this, these are the bits that we can add on top that allow them to then operate in this space and in this organization at this point. But that's the thing of being human. You know, you've seen in the book I write about, you know, and sometimes I say this and there are people in the audience who do this or have done it, but you know, there were folks who would pick up bowling pins in bowling alleys. Right. And you know, that that wasn't the sole purpose that they were kind of brought to term and born, right? And they're doing something else now. But with anybody, you know, all of these are skills to be learned. You know, last year it was Bitcoin, this, you know, the year before it was Bitcoin, this year ChatGPT, next year Google Gaga, the year after Higi Haga. There's always going to be something else which we know as technologists. And so I think there is something about being open to those skills and those being skills that folks can learn. Also, we are creating new knowledge, which again is a huge thing we have at the Institute for Future of Work, which is we're trying to explore we're actually trying to ensure that we can still promote well-being at work through the deployment of these technologies under something that we call our Good Work Charter. But you only know, and you can only kind of build that knowledge if we then step into that new space and deploy those skills, and then we kind of look back and we reflect, and then we step again. And so again, we all have to be in this learning loop, which I'd argue is a very, very agile thing. That's why we have retros, kind of how we do things, right? And so it's deploying that in other places, not just on product development.
But it's also a different mindset and way of thinking, though, isn't it?
Yes,
because
exactly. Yeah, and it's that mindset, which you can do collectively as an organization.
Yeah. I mean, agile tools are one thing, but agile mindset and ways of thinking are something different. But I think if I take that and I look at tech fluency that you talk quite a lot about. Is that an example of tech fluency? Can you define a little bit for us what technically fluent means? Because I think it's really interesting from an upskilling point of view, but also, what I read in your book around creating your own personal agency, around upskilling yourself so that you're in control of whatever technology is around, and it just basically becomes the way of life, because technology is now the way of life.
Yeah. So with tech fluency, so there's different folks that have tried to define it. There's actually something called the digital skills framework that I reference in the book, that came out of Martha Lane Fox's Go On however many years ago. But we have this kind of notion of basic digital skills. And then I think Lloyds Bank now has a digital skills index that they track yearly for folks who are in work and kind of different demographics as well. And so when I talk about digital literacy and digital fluency, it is about understanding some of these basics, but understanding them in a way that then that they can apply in different places. And some of it feels silly, right? Like if you're super technical, I don't know, the notion that you switch something off and switch it back on again, like as a way to reset and restart things, and that works, is definitely something you can apply in lots of different spaces where you do. Like if you're at a friend's house and you're trying to do the microwave and it doesn't work, you do just unplug it and you plug it back again, right? The same way as you do that with your mouse. If it doesn't connect again, you disconnect it, you reconnect it. So I think there's that kind of technical fluency that then ends up meaning that you can repeat that same action in different spaces, knowing that there's that kind of similarity. But you've also got digital fluency in data and the safety of data, right? And knowing that when you sign up for things, so if you're trying a new platform, you're not going to start off by putting your credit card number and your personal mobile phone number and your real date of birth. You're probably going to put something slightly different because this is about a test and you don't know where that data is going to go. So digital fluency is around is understanding those basics, but also knowing those basics today isn't necessarily going to be isn't going to in its current state continue on to be helpful to you in 5 years' time. So I don't know, if there's a ChatGPT thing coming up, you're like, okay, cool. What is this ChatGPT? How does it reflect and how does it relate to what I already knew and what I already understood? What in my head, what does it kind of fit into? What might I use it for? And so if you're able to kind of do that and almost categorize as you go, then you can say, okay, for my knitting, maybe it can give me a knitting pattern, right? Or for my food and the eating that I need to do, or my workout plan or whatever it is, maybe that's something I can explore and I can play with. So I think digital fluency isn't in knowing all the answers. It's in understanding how to experiment, how to explore, and then being able to then spot the patterns of the repeatability of some of those concepts across different places. Just like settings, we know what settings are. And again, UX folks, that you'll know this, right? You have the hamburger, you've got all these conventions. That means that if I do turn up in Japan tomorrow and I'm trying to use a system, I probably can navigate it, visually with some of those norms, assuming the norms are the same in Japan. Maybe they're not, right? Yes. But this is what I come to it with, knowing that I might not understand everything I'm seeing, but I probably have enough to navigate to a particular point, after which then it becomes new learning, and we're looking forward and we're enjoying that idea of new learning.
If I dare to step out and if I dare to try it and just see what happens. I mean, it's interesting. What do you think the most transformative thing is in education and education systems for that to happen? Because, for learning to take precedence over knowledge in terms of knowing, being right.
That's a big question, Susie. I mean, what's going to be the biggest thing in the next election cycle or on the horizon? There's so many things that we need to crack, or still trying to explore to crack, from things like assessment. How do you assess? What are you assessing for? Do we need grades? Is it a bad thing that someone's used AI, or is it a better thing that they're able to defend what they've created and what they've submitted? So that's kind of the very long term, the bits of what even is knowledge, should our fields exist as they are now, kind of as iron cast divided spaces where really they should be more interdisciplinary and more permeable and more interoperable. That's definitely a big thing that we should have. Should learning only be for the sake of business, or should actually we learn for the sake of learning? Big question there. I think in the short term, what we do need is actually systemically, we need the right structures and supports for teachers to stay in post.
Yes. Yeah.
As a big one, as in running STEMets, there's lots of work that we get to do with schools and work with different senior leadership teams, different multi-academy trusts, different kind of players across the sector. And it really is a crunch. Education, the university system is the same, right? Even I saw something the other day looking at kind of T levels and apprenticeships and the fact that
really, there's actually quite a small proportion of folks that will be able to engage with them because of the way the system works, the amount of time someone needs to spend on site. So I think there's actually quite a lot of things to kind of unpick in education. And I'd argue, and it's kind of why I run STEMets, that we also have to know and recognize that education doesn't just happen in formal spaces.
No, exactly.
How do we encourage a culture of learning where folks can do that at all ages? Because also education doesn't just stop at 18 or stop at 20 when you finished your degree or your apprenticeship or your boot camp. So I think there's quite a lot of that we need to do, where it's everyone's in this loop, like we're saying, everyone's in that moment. Because also you'd be toast the way that actually my computer science degree is it. And then in 10 years time we're on whatever the next iteration is and they didn't cover it in your degree. What do you do then? You still have to learn, right? And so I think that's probably the biggest thing, is we need to know that education isn't just confined to a classroom or a lecture theatre.
And I mean, clearly you were curious right from the get-go, but is it something you cultivate daily, your curiosity? Because I think it's interesting, people just, oh, well, you're curious, you're not. I think that's a little bit binary. What do you
it's absolute rubbish, really. We're all born curious, otherwise we wouldn't be walking, you know. Those early things is because you're trying to do something new, you're trying to explore. So we're all born curious. It's just that it's something that might be punished or might be disincentivized the older that you get, and the different types of spaces that you exist in, which, you know, there is something for us as leaders, there's an opportunity and there's a responsibility, actually. I'd say we have to nurture curiosity, to give folks space to play and to try and to experiment and to explore. And so I think, it's definitely something that I nurture. It's something I have nurtured in other folks and other tribes and groups that I'm part of. But it's definitely, I think it's something internally that I actually feel it's kind of one of those muscles that the more that you exercise it and the stronger it gets, the better that you see things start to happen, right? Start to develop, start to be created. And so I think there's something magical about, you know, being curious across different. There's something magical about being curious across different spaces and trying to marry those things together. You've got to be curious. We ran a hack. We ran an AI hack for some young people in Bristol a couple of weeks ago, and it was so interesting. The curiosity that they had around, I don't know, medicine or art or animals, because children animals. And you know, having one brief of how would you use AI to help the world, and having teenagers build an AI that could identify different artists, like the art of different artists, and be able to inspire new artworks and new kind of expressions in the same kind of room, same group, but a different kind of working on a different project, was ones that had been able to identify a liver that had cirrhosis versus a healthy liver, and another group that, as I said, animals could tell a squirrel from a hedgehog from a deer. So then if you come across them as you're going on a walk in the woodland forest, you can identify which it is and know which of the agencies to call to help out. And I think there is something about the curiosity of, you know, you've got that tech, where are the different places you might deploy that tool, where are the different things you might apply, what more do we need to understand about how livers work, and, you know, make sure this AI can work. And they figured it out for livers. They actually didn't figure it out for brains in the time that they had, and brain tumors. But I think there is something about, you know, you explore, you're curious, you ask questions, you try, you experiment, you play, and then you come back again. And as I say, it's very much an agile approach that actually, you know, if you take it on as a mindset, works really, really well.
And I think it takes you from ego to eco, doesn't it? It gets you excited and curious, and you want to create a bigger tribe to do that, a bigger place to do that, a bigger space to do that. And you have learning
from things that haven't worked. And also, I think if you are truly curious, it gives space for those perspectives. Because you're like, actually, let's find someone that has that liver cirrhosis, right? Or whatever it might be. Let's find someone that knows a hedgehog, right? So I'm doing this before. And so then you start to ask those questions and look out, rather than, like you said, converging. And it's important to converge, because you have to decide on,
of course,
you know, your backlog or whatever it is, but you don't converge forever, right? You diverge, and you do need to have that ebb and flow for ideas to flow, for you to be truly innovative. So definitely making important to make room for it.
And if I look back at your journey to where you are today, who are you? I mean, who were your role models? Who inspired you? It's such an interesting question, because you've done so much, and it's so eclectic. My first thoughts were, okay, I wonder who your role models were and what inspired you.
So when I was very young, my role model was Tim Berners-Lee, and that was because I knew he was British, I knew he was a physicist, I knew he'd made the web. I spent all my time on the web, and so I had a sense of how global it was, and was like, how incredible would it be, coming through the same system to make something that's also globally significant. I got a little bit older, worked a little bit on STEMettes actually, or was kind of early career, and ended up hearing about Stephanie Shirley, who some folks will have heard of. I'm sure folks will have seen speak or may have even watched her TED Talk. And I remember being really frustrated actually, because I wasn't alive in the 1960s. And when folks had told me about the 1960s, it's all been Twiggy and miniskirts, and nothing at all against Twiggy or miniskirts. The 1960s was also the time when Stephanie Shirley, aka Steve Shirley, was at her peak, running a tech business of women who were mathematicians and weren't allowed to work anymore at places like the post office because they'd given birth.
Yes.
Who were working from home from their kitchen tables, doing small projects like, I don't know, the flight receiver for Concorde, or our stock control systems, or our train and bus.
Incredible. And
I remember thinking, oh my goodness, what a story, what a woman. She's still alive as well. She's still with us. The Queen knew who she was because she's got, all those honours and and all the stuff on that end. But how incredible that she was doing that at a time when she literally had to change her name to Steve for business purposes so she could get in the room and make those pitches. She wasn't allowed to, open a bank account without her husband's permission. Like, there's all these things. And even if you kind of delve even more into the story, those women were kicked out of those organizations, and then they were all part of a partnership. So it wasn't just her as a stakeholder, they were her stakeholders, they were her shareholders, but also they were being paid much more to do jobs that they were already doing, that they'd been kicked out of post-war. There was this move to build the IT industry as kind of a strategic thing for the UK at least, but wanted to have the men coming back to work, and it kind of, they trained their successors and then kicked out the organization, and then Steve Shirley brought them all into the company, and they charged a hell of a load of money of them as consultants back to the and there's all these things. It's like, wow, that's what she did in the 1960s. What am I doing now in the 2020s? What am I doing with my life? So Stephanie Shirley, a huge role model for me.
Brilliant. And how did STEMettes, what was your vision like when you started STEMettes? Did you expect it to be what it is today? Did you expect it to have the massive impacts it's already had?
No. And I don't take for granted what has happened over the now 11 years, but no, it was called the STEMettes Project for the first year. It was a New Year's resolution in 2013. I mean, most folks, I don't know, said they wanted to try yoga. Nobody really said they were going to start something like this, and there I was doing that. I did not realise I guess I knew it was important, but I didn't realise how systemically important the problem it was as a solution to such a big problem, and also just I just didn't take for granted that what we were doing was going to be transformative. I did not realize the kind of the size of the appetite. I knew there would be some. I didn't realize how big it would be. I also, and still now, I'm kind of frustrated at how little provision there still is. And this is something we still see for women's organizations. Women Who Code has just closed. We've got that news of the week that we're recording. So there's no funding really for organizations like ours for something that really we shouldn't even need to exist really. Systemically, you tell these stories, you do these things equitably, and you don't have a gender gap in subject choices, in the industry, in the progression of folks coming through. So I couldn't have imagined. And that's not even just from the beginning. Like, I don't know, 5 years in, we've been here for 10 years. I wouldn't have imagined 11 years later I'd be sat here having these discussions, right, in these lots of different spaces, and maybe I could have guessed I would be still talking about it because, as you said, social norms take a while to change, but not still. You always want to know you're doing a good thing. You go to the supermarket and there's kind of loads of different bread brands, right, and on the shelves, and you're like, how many more new bread brands can we get, right? They're definitely onto something, because they're all making bread, and people are always buying bread because it's been the best thing since sliced bread. But I wouldn't have thought that we'd still now not have as much provision as we should. There are other folks working in the space, but not nearly enough for how important it is that we get this right for formative years. So then there's slightly less work to do when it does then come to industry and folks that are stepping academia, or folks that are starting their own businesses in this space as well.
And because a lot of people are doing that a lot more than before after COVID. The effect of the COVID pandemic has also been people thinking a lot more about their potential, their skills, what they're doing, why they're doing it, and stepping out or stepping into different roles within an organization. Have you seen that sort of reflected in what you're doing in STEMets? Has there been a change in pace or a change in focus, or?
Not really, not necessarily as a COVID. I mean, a consequence of COVID would be how many things we are doing that are hybrid now. A consequence might be the number of folks that maybe want to look into kind of biomed and that side of things. They saw the impact that vaccines had in such a short period of time. But no, I actually wouldn't say from our end, but bear in mind, you know, on the STEMets end, this is very young. So a lot, I mean, those are people that we work with, and this number will increase, won't even remember COVID, right? Goes on, that number increases. I think there's definitely been societal shifts in COVID that we get to see. There's also things like cost of living and Brexit and all the rest of it that happened at the same time that's then impacting the choices folks feel able to make about work and about study. So I think we're definitely seeing tweaks, and that's not just in the young people, but also in the parents engaging with them, but also things like flexible working and how that used to be a thing that we could say, you know, in tech you get to flexibly work, whereas now post-COVID, of course, everyone's had to work. Not everyone, but there's a proportion of society that's been able to flexible work since that don't work in technology. So yeah, I think there's maybe been some certain edits to the story or to the narrative. Yeah.
And so what do you think is the biggest lever for democratizing access then? Because I know gender parity and sort of having all voices represented is one way of making it more inclusive, but actually democratizing access to tech and digital.
So I think that the biggest lever for democratizing access, I do think that some of the biggest levers that we do have, and without being too political, I think this is a reflection on the priorities of government that we had in this period. I think policy is a really big lever because it allows you to systemically incentivize things, and this is such a big problem that, you know, the companies stand to gain, society stands to gain, our health outcomes stand to gain, our education outcomes stand to gain from folks having that right access to digital tools, having those basic digital skills. So I think it's a national, I mean, we know it's international, but I think it's a national question, and it's even things like infrastructure. You know, if we get to travel up into the country, it's alarming the number of schools we go into, and there's a bit of a health warning as we enter in to say the internet might go down today.
Yeah.
As we're running my team had to run a session in Colchester last week with no internet in the school, tethered to their phones.
Wow.
Run that coding session. I was up in a school in Newcastle a couple of months ago, and it was the same thing. You know, when the trees grow too tall and the council doesn't cut them in time, our signal that gets pinged from the primary school up the road, you know, gets cut by the trees, and so the kids are offline. And it's things like that where it's like, okay, cool, what's the investments we've made? Because there are some cities in the country where that doesn't happen. Maybe to central London, the speed is awful, right? To other places you have no signal whatsoever. So where's the connectivity, infrastructure wise, what's going on? Let alone then folks actually having access to those devices in a way that's affordable. And then having access to devices doesn't mean you know how to use them.
No, of course.
So what's the infrastructure we have for folks learning? And again, it shouldn't be that you have to learn those skills in school, because most of us are not in school anymore. And so what are the other places that you can engage? What's our national appetite for learning? What's our culture for being able to tap into that and understand these in the same way that, I don't know, driving licenses, maybe they take a little bit longer to expire, but you know, we have these things of, hey, like if you're going to engage with it, here are the basics. Here's how you keep yourself safe and also keep the country safe by not, but making us vulnerable because of the way that you use data and in a kind of on a kind of cyber strata. So I think there's all manner of different places. There's policy that we could do on media companies to ensure that there's a little bit more that's going on as folks are accessing this, as folks are watching the television, as folks are watching particular videos or engaging in particular content. There's so much around, the age at which folks are on social media. That there's too many things. So I think a lot of it does end up being civically inspired policy, bottom-up policy. With us knowing that strategically as a country, if we're going to, to head towards being a superpower, you can't be a superpower if folks don't have access to this. You can't be a superpower if people don't understand these things. Where's that going to, you're going to materialize that out of thin air? So I think there's lots that can be done, but I think the biggest lever is policy. to ensure that folks, all the actors that have a stake in this are acting in the right direction. It won't be necessarily that they work as a collective, but it definitely will be that you can have enough levers and enough things pushing in the right direction that then give you benefits in other places that allow you to then have that fully funded or make that work. And I think there's a long-termism that maybe our electoral cycles don't allow for. And so I think a lot of bad behaviour has been disincentivized at the top, that you need to kind of, you know, we should rise up, right?
Yeah. I mean, if I come back to that, and I come back to the start of our discussion, which was women taking tech back and STEMettes, what's your vision, Anne-Marie, for your legacy in that space in the next 5 to 10 years?
So in the next 10 years, I mean, I'd love for us to close STEMettes. I'd love for it at least to be that in the formative years, folks don't have an experience that missells them on what the opportunities are within STEM and STEAM, so including the arts in there as well, what innovation looks like, but also without it, right? So outside of that space, if you're not going into something that's overtly STEM or STEAM related, there's still going to be some sort of technical literacy that you need. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is more of a permeability that folks have for entering into and exiting the tech sector. You know, you meet journos who are ex-lawyers, you know, you meet all these other folks that are doing things that are taking different parts of life and applying it in different spaces. I think it's definitely something we need to be able to see inside of technology. So again, we've got that diversity of perspectives, and it's not just like me who have been classically trained making these decisions for everybody. I'll tell you something, I know a lot of technical things, there are a lot of things in life I do not know anything about, and so it actually be quite dangerous for me to build those systems single-handedly with impact. And I think the final piece that I'd love to see that might not happen in 10 years, but could begin to happen in 10 years, and I say this having been at our launch for the Institute for Future of Work sandbox with regulators yesterday, is much better, much more robust policy ecosystem where folks have a little bit more of a technical literacy and understanding, because this technology is only continuing, and it still is going to be, and it's not going away from society, where we're able to then legislate, regulate, hold folks accountable in a way that makes sense and is meaningful, and isn't just tech companies have you know, marked their own homework, and we continue to have all of the kind of the societal dangers amplified and magnified and multiplied by the use of those tech systems. And so I think that's something I know we won't have that in 10 years, but it would be great to have seen much more progress in 10 years on that front. But I don't see why in 10 years we couldn't have a much better set of formative, positive STEM and STEAM experiences for folks of all genders, of all creeds, right, of all backgrounds, where they're able to have their eyes opened and know that their horizons are opened by STEM, and that they don't have to be a genius that does the maths really quickly in order to have value to offer, and so they can make an informed decision about whether they want to be at those tables or whether they need to be at those tables or not.
Yeah, and what they need to be at those tables, because like you say, there's often a stereotype, I need to be brilliant in maths and computer science and physics to do this type of thing, and actually that's not true, is it?
It's not a prerequisite for everyone that's at that table. Yes, you should have some people that understand computer science,
of course,
you know, from top to bottom, but you can't solely have those people at the table, because that's why we have disaster upon disaster upon disaster of tech projects.
Okay, time is running. I do have one last question though for you. Would you have any final recommendations or a call to action for our listeners thinking, okay, I need to start being more in control, in which case they should read your book. The guidebook is very explicit and there's lots in there. But you know, someone who's sat there thinking, okay, I need to do something with my team. I need to start engaging my team in my organization around an understanding of this, and therefore a personal responsibility in terms of technical fluency.
So lots of different things I suggest to folks. Better Allies is a great set of resources. It's a book as well by Karen, I forget her surname. So that would be one resource. Invisible Women is another book I'd highly recommend folks read and have a look at. We at STEMettes were part of a 4-year practice research collaboration with the Institute of Education, looking at the social justice actually element of STEM and STEM outreach and what happens in informal learning spaces over and above what happens in formal spaces. And we ended up developing from our practice something called an equity compass that I think is a fantastic tool. So
interesting.
yes,
Okay.
STEM, so YESTEM.org. There's a free course that folks can do on FutureLearn to understand what equitable practice looks like, because this isn't about equality, because everybody's not equal, everyone's not the same. Actually, there's a lot of differences. We need to value those differences and reflect them in what we're doing. And so you have to listen. You have to have an equitable practice over the long term. You have to be working to do things not for a particular group or to a particular group, but with a particular group. And so it's a really handy tool that actually we use as well to kind of review, you know, the work that we're doing, the initiatives that we're running, to ensure that we are still being equitable. It's why we have a youth board at Stemet. So, you know, we're not just doing things for young people, we're doing it with them, and they sit on our trustee board, right? So, you know, I have to report to the young people in the work that we're doing. So that'd be my thing, is there's so much to do. If you're going to be in this iterative agile loop, do your first experiments, like do your research and experiments, set your hypotheses, do the experiment, build, measure, learn, and iterate and go again. But you have to be started. You have to be making mistakes and making better mistakes and making high quality mistakes in order for this to move and for this to shift. And part of you being a leader is, you know, providing the environment for folks to do that, doing the experimenting yourself, and then taking those learnings and being able to build that trust with folks in your organization that this is a journey we're on, this is something I'm part of, this is something that's a priority, and this is something we can see the benefits of doing it in each loop and in each iteration that we're doing.
Okay. I'm going to leave our listeners with that, getting curious about, you know, creating an environment where failure is permitted and that learning is also the way of being, as opposed to just the way of working. Okay, Anne-Marie, thank you very much for coming on and sharing all your research and insights and experience. Where can people find out more about you and what you do and Stemet?
Oh, I don't know. I have an Instagram. I have a newsletter, I should really say. Imafidon.com would be good. Or just visit Stemet. I mean, pretty much everything's through there. Institute for Future of Work is on ifow.org, which is our kind of the abbreviation for us. Yeah, I mean, read the book, I guess, would be the place to start. And there'll be all kinds of jobs. You don't really want to know about me, I'm sure. You want to know about the organizations and what they're doing. So yeah, so that would be my, on most good social media platforms, although who knows what's the definition of a good social media platform these days.
That's a whole different podcast. Okay, I'll put the links in the show notes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Thanks for your time.
Awesome.